Good evening. Good evening, thank you. Good evening and welcome to the 2017 Global Abundance Dinner. Yes. We're so glad to welcome those of you who've been with us for the past day and a half for the programs here at the Global Action Summit. And for those of you who are joining us from the community this evening, a very special welcome to you as you join leaders from literally around the world. We are fortunate this year to have leaders and experts from every continent on the planet with the exception of Antarctica. So next year we're going to have to do a better job of outreach to Antarctica. Yes, there we go. For those of you who are just joining us, let me say for the last day and a half, we've had some remarkable conversations about what we've done over the last 5 years. This year, 2016, is a very important milestone year for us. We've completed 5 years of work. We've created a knowledge base of expertise related to food, health, and economic issues. This wonderful campus here at One City has opened, and we're launching projects for the first time, commercial projects in the Philippines, in the Rural Laboratory for Rural Solutions that we're developing there. So this is a year that marks a major pivot from research and development, from developing our core relationships, institutional partnerships, basic program structures, to becoming much more active, much more focused on initiatives that have measurable, tangible results. So we are delighted to have you with us to help celebrate the achievements of the last 5 years and to help us look forward to what we're going to do in the coming 5 and 10 and 20 years. Our mission, as you know, is to advance scalable, sustainable solutions for abundant food, health, and prosperity. As our opening panel, who reflected with us on what we've learned over the last 5 years, pointed out, there are a lot of complexities in coming up with solutions for those issues. There are a lot of complexities, there are a lot of disconnections, there are a lot of things that need to be done. But we believe very strongly that we also sit on top of an explosion of creativity and innovation, a rising tide of goodwill and collaborative interest in forming what Howard Shapiro refers to as uncommon collaborations, to bring together people who've never worked together to come up with solutions that have never been tried before. These are the things that the Global Action Platform is dedicated to, and to bringing together people like you who want to work together toward those ends. So again, we're so honored and delighted to have you with us here tonight. We're going to have an interesting program, and to kick that off, I'd like to introduce the General Manager of the One City Campus, Ryan Doyle, who has a very special announcement.
Thank you, Scott. Music heals. Music unites. Music provides an artist the outlet for their creativity to inspire the community. Uniting a community focused on health and creativity is a building block of One City. And whether the spotlight is on One City, Nashville, or the breadth of our great state of Tennessee, there was no greater champion for uniting our community than Kitty Moon Emery. Throughout her career, Kitty broke barriers in politics, business, and civic leadership. She was an influential force behind United States senators and national media strategies for presidents like Ronald Reagan's campaign. In her time as chairwoman of the Metro Sports Authority, she led the recruitment of both Nashville's current professional sports teams to Music City. And in Music City, she was a preeminent civic leader in the Country Music Association, the CMA Charitable Foundation, Leadership Music, and the Rotary Club of Nashville, to name a few. All of this while leading her multi-million-dollar film and production firm, Scene 3. Many of you in this room know her for her leadership with the Global Action Platform. There's no question that Kitty was the foundation from the beginning in the progress that has been made in Global Action Platform's work locally as well as abroad. When you were with Kitty, you knew that her town welcomed you. She led with her enchanting smile and often left you with a "love ya." Those of us blessed to work with her were continually pushed to build our foundation, but assume nothing, think differently, and reach for the stars. Kitty called for the stars to shine down on the innovators, artists, and community builders who were leading our region forward. She never asked for credit. She always directed from behind the camera or behind the soundboard, positioning others for great leadership, while we all knew our mentor and friend was the catalyst for our successes. Well, soon, Kitty, the spotlight you've pointed on so many of us will finally be on you. Just outside this tent, the foundation is being completed for the future home of Nashville's most innovative venue. Part public art, part community space, and 100% a launch pad for future talent to dream big. Cambridge and One City Nashville have partnered with Branch Technology, a cutting-edge Tennessee firm specializing in large-scale 3D printing, bringing unprecedented design freedom and resource stewardship to the construction industry. Innovation is in our collective DNA, and over many iterations, our design team has pushed the envelope in every way imaginable to create what will arguably be the largest 3D printed stage canopy in the world. As we speak, the robots are gearing up to begin fabrication. Each component of the stage canopy will be meticulously engineered and printed right here in Tennessee by the world's largest freeform 3D printers. The matrix of printed material eliminates 100% of waste and is inspired by structures that occur naturally in the environment, creating a dynamic structure to house events planned to bring the community together. Each component is designed carefully in collaboration with the design and engineering team, and the components are delivered and erected on site. It begins to look something like this: an immersive structure designed to engage and delight the community. As the last installment of our shared outdoor space, the stage was envisioned to be a beacon for the community. We believe this place will be for family and friends, for the arts, for lifelong learning, for personal and communal well-being, and most importantly, for Nashville. All of these things were part of Kitty's DNA, and for that reason, this place will be named after her. We hope you all will join us next spring when we open this venue to continue inspiring global thought, local impact, and some great music. We are confident that under Kitty's mindful inspiration from above, this will become a place for Nashville to create, inspire, heal, and unite our community. And as Kitty would say, thank you, friend.
Please welcome to the stage DJ King, who will present the 2017.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to recognize tonight's Early Stage Global Action Challenge Award recipient. This award was first created out of a partnership between Clayton Associates, Altitude Ventures, and the Global Action Platform to provide $100,000 in financing to young companies positioned to have a transformative impact on food, health, and prosperity. As this competition and our global needs have continued to grow, so too has our commitment to this program, which is why I'm thrilled to present this year's recipient of the Global Action Challenge and our largest investment yet of $1.2 million to Patrick Randolph, founder and CEO of QDoctor. Access to high-quality healthcare is one of society's greatest challenges and affects a multitude of populations ranging from urban and rural families to veterans. QDoctor is a technology platform created to help solve these problems. The company's fully automated system fills canceled clinical appointments to increase provider capacities, reduce high labor costs in the system, and improve patient engagement, all of which advance our mission here today. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Patrick Randolph, and congratulate the QDoctor team as the recipients of the 2017 Global Action Challenge.
For those of you who were here last year, to add a word to the wonderful comments from Ryan, you may remember that we gave a special tribute to Kitty, who had only recently been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and fought a very valiant fight against that. But she was able to watch from home the performance and the tribute given to her last year, and was passed away in February of this year. So I can only say how grateful all of us with Global Action Platform are for what you're doing here at One City to commemorate her legacy. And I know many people in this community, including her dear friend Colleen Conway Welch, who we honor at this event each year as well. Thank you, Colleen. In addition to the investments we've been making with our partners in terms of innovative companies and transformative technologies, the Global Action Platform has been honored to work with KPMG International in recognizing corporations that do an amazing job and a successful job at incorporating shared value into their corporate strategies and business practices. The Global Shared Value Award is the annual award we've created together to recognize and encourage corporations to address major societal challenges through innovative business strategy, that is, to create shared value. The award recognizes private sector engagement and innovation that improve the quality of life and build prosperity for companies, individuals, communities, regions, and the world. If I may, I'd like to now invite Trevor Davies and Tucker Foote to come join me on the stage. And Fareed, we'll ask you in just a moment as well. It is my pleasure to announce this year's 2017 Global Shared Value Award goes to MasterCard. And here is Tucker Foote from MasterCard. MasterCard's stated mission is to deploy its technology and enterprise to make payments safe, simple, and smart in pursuit of a vision of a world beyond cash. In selecting MasterCard, the 2017 Global Shared Value Award, for the 2017 Global Shared Value Award, the independent award panel drawn from business, academic, nonprofit leadership noted that the company is doing something highly innovative and distinctly different from others in its industry that creates substantial shared value and is deeply integrated with its core competitive strategy. So let me now allow Tucker to come up and make some comments.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Trevor. Hello, everyone. I'm Tucker Foote. I work at MasterCard, and it's a great honor to get this distinction here. I will say that I'm especially privileged to work with colleagues who care and want to make a difference, but also for a company that has a reach and an ability to make a difference. At MasterCard, we operate today in 210 countries and territories. Don't ask me to name them all, but that's what I'm told where we operate. And when I say we operate, we're not a credit card company. We don't issue cards, we don't set rates, we don't set terms. We run a technology platform that's in every corner around the world that allows people to buy things and sell things. Now, despite this reach, there are still 2 billion people today that lack access to the financial mainstream. So about 2 years ago, our CEO called a bunch of folks together and said, there are 2 billion people today. I want to reach 500 million by 2020. We said, okay. Since that time, the last 2 years, we've started 500 programs in 50 different countries. And a core tenet of every one of those programs is a shared value and a partnership. We can't do things without meeting the objectives of government, people, and the private sector. So today, we've reached 350 million, and we know our work is just beginning. So, we care, and I'll say this, that tomorrow we're going to wake up at MasterCard, we're going to bring our hearts and minds to work, and we're going to keep working for this problem. And anyone in this room or anyone around the world that has an idea that can make a difference where we can partner, we want to hear them and we want to be your partner. So thank you for this award, and it's great to be here.
For those of you who are wondering what this is and what this is made of, every year we've commissioned a local Tennessee artist from the beginning of this. Mars Danone have received this award in past years, and each year the artist selects a reclaimed log from a different tree as the basis for the sculpture. So we've had black walnut, we've had cherry. Tonight this is Osage orange. And it has a wonderful variation in color and texture. So it's our pleasure to recognize you for the great work that you're doing around the world, and we look forward to working with you in future years. It's now my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and one of the most thoughtful commentators, obviously, on today's world stage about developments occurring around the world that are affecting our future and that help us understand the dynamics behind the change that's underway in the world, and to bring a thoughtfulness and an inclusiveness to that understanding of the world that is so often missing in our media and our public life, which has become so divisive and so polarized. It's been a true honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to work with Fareed Zakaria over the last several years as our summit host and moderator. And so it's now, again, once again, a wonderful pleasure to welcome him to the stage for this evening's keynote.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I really do feel like every year the excitement builds, the energy builds, people are networking more, they're enjoying themselves more. I think that the lunch discussion for me in many ways encapsulated why I like this summit so much, because it really was a solutions-oriented discussion rather than a problems-oriented discussion. It was a conversation about how to partner with groups, not a kind of top-down process. It was interdisciplinary in the best sense. I mean, one of the things you have to give Scott enormous credit for is he's trying to operate at the intersection of 3, 4 different industries in which no one quite sees why they should help the other industry succeed. And it is enforcing those interactions and those intersections to happen that you get real solutions. Because the only solutions that are going to work are going to be bottom-up, are going to be networked, are going to be public-private, are going to be beyond partisanship in some way. And I think that it's a very hard challenge. It'd be much easier to do a financial services conference and get MasterCard and all the big banks to sponsor it, and that there's a certain kind of easy logic to that, but it doesn't solve the real problems of the world. And I really do think that it's an extraordinary achievement to be able to bring this critical mass from so many disparate strains. Now, I am going to talk about what are the great challenges and trends we face. I feel as though we get this chance to have a kind of annual conversation where we take stock of where things are. Now, you will remember the world looked like a very different place when we last had this conversation, because it was before the pivotal events of November of last year. And if you ask me, I was just in Singapore last week. I was in Europe a couple of weeks before that. One thing that has happened is we have a unified global conversation taking place now. And everyone wants to talk about Donald Trump. And I'm sure secretly in his bedroom he is enormously proud of that achievement. Because if you are measuring yourself in a sense by a kind of television star metric, well, everybody is watching. And so I was thinking to myself, what should we talk about? At some level, it's all so bizarre and different and unprecedented that it's difficult to even know where to begin. You think about what people remember in history from political campaigns and the early years or months of a presidency, and it's generally interesting, but it's the words that remain with us. It's the words that we remember. People still remember that Franklin Roosevelt stood at the steps of the Capitol and said, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself," as the Great Recession and Great Depression raged on. People still remember John F. Kennedy looking out at that same portico and saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And so I do wonder sometimes, what will people remember from this last year, right? I mean, will it be the moment in the presidential campaign when one presidential nominee, Marco Rubio, said to another, Donald Trump, essentially that he had a small penis? You may try to forget that, but it did actually happen on national television. And you might remember that Donald Trump indignantly responded with great fury, not that this was a demeaning attack beneath the dignity of the presidency of the United States, but that it was factually inaccurate. One of many claims that Donald Trump has made that are not independently easy to verify. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying it's difficult to verify these things. So that is where we are, right? That is the circus of American politics. One of the things that the guys in Singapore told me, Singapore is probably the best run city-state in the world. I mean, everything is measured and managed, and they go and look at best practices around the world, and they commission 3 academic studies before they'll change the traffic lanes. And they were watching us. And so one of them, a very senior minister, said to me, will this finally please get Americans to stop telling us to copy America in every respect? Are you finally inoculated from that disease? I said, I wouldn't count on it. But anyway, beyond the sort of the circus aspect of it, there is something very real and very important that is happening in the United States, and it's happening around the world. And I think it's important that we try to understand it because it actually affects the issues that we have all been discussing today. And that is the rise of populism. This is not just happening in the United States. Trump is not an isolated phenomenon. It is happening in Europe with Brexit. It's happening in other parts of the world. And it's important to try to understand what is fueling it. You know, it's a difficult challenge to kind of accept because it's so large and diffuse. But let me try to talk about what it seems to me has been going on. There's one part of this that clearly is about capitalism in its modern, current incarnation. Globalized capitalism that has been at work for the last 25 years since the end of the Cold War. And it has been an amazing machine. It has been an amazing money-making machine, wealth-spreading machine. Let us not forget that in the last 25 years, more people have been moved out of poverty than in the preceding 100 years. It's about 500 million people, mostly in China and India, but in large parts of the world. And that process has been extraordinary and dynamic. But it has had a certain, certain characteristics that I think we sometimes are reluctant to talk about. So let me give you one sense of how you can look at this world and see what has happened. So if I had a PowerPoint here, I'd put this up, but somebody once told me, please don't use PowerPoints. People who use PowerPoints never have any power, and they rarely have a point. So I'm not going to do this with a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk to you. I think you can remember this. My apologies to anybody tomorrow who's presenting with a PowerPoint. If you look at American recessions and recoveries from World War II onward, they have followed a very similar pattern. The economy goes into recession, then it comes out of recession, and then with a bit of a time lag, the unemployment rate gets back to where it was. So in other words, the economy comes back and then the jobs come back. Makes sense to all of those of you in business. You first notice economic growth picking up, and then you say to yourself, okay, there's demand, I'll start hiring again, right? And that is that time lag, that delay between when the economy came back and the jobs would come back was about 6 months, from 1945 to 1990. Very set pattern. Recession of the early 1990s, the economy comes back after the recession, as always, and the jobs come back, but they don't come back 6 months later. They come back 15 months later. And then you have the recession of the early 2000s. And the economy comes back, and the jobs come back, but not 6 months later, not 15 months later, 29 months later. And then we had the most recent recession, 07, 08. And the economy comes back, and the jobs come back, but not 6 months later, not 15 months later, not 29 months later, 64 months later. So what happened after 1990 somehow is that we lost that connection between the economy and jobs, between capital and labor. So you have had this extraordinary growth of GDP in many parts of the world, but it hasn't meant that you have seen employment gains, wage gains, particularly for the average person. And why is this happening? Well, one clue might be that it's been happening since the 1990s. What has characterized the global economy since the 1990s? Fall of the Berlin Wall, coming together of all these countries, all participating in a single global system. So that's globalization. And the second piece has been this extraordinary information revolution that we are all now aware of. And these are amazing, wondrous, highly productive things. But they have certain characteristics. If you're a company, it's a great world to be in because you can find a place that has cheap cost of capital, and you get capital from there. You find a place that has cheap cost of labor, and you get your labor from there. And you find a place that's growing fast, and you sell into there. And that global arbitrage that you can play almost on a weekly basis is what has resulted in the most extraordinary period of profitability for the large companies of the world that you've ever seen. I mean, look, corporate balance sheets today are richer than they have ever been before. And that's true in the United States, it's true in Germany, it's true in Britain. But if you're the guy living in rural Pennsylvania and you have some skills, but not a whole hell of a lot of skills, you look at this world and you can't play that global arbitrage. Those forces work as a pincer movement on your wages, right? And all of a sudden you face a very uncertain future because your job can either be done by a machine or it can be done by somebody in China or India or the Philippines. And so you face that reality. And you face this future with a much different sense where eagerness and anticipation and hope are replaced by anxiety and fear. You know, if you think about what this world looks like, take one of the most fascinating new innovations that we are sure to see, driverless cars. It's quite possible 25 years from now we'll wonder, how did we ever let human beings do something as dangerous as drive a car, right? I mean, the machine will never get drunk. The machine will never get lost. The machine will never find it too rainy. And somehow it will get you where you need to go. Well, keep in mind that in that wondrous future, you have to account for this inconvenient fact. 3 million Americans drive a car, bus, or truck for a living. 3 million Americans. They're almost all non-college educated, and they're almost all over 40. And so when you say you're going to retrain them to become software engineers, good luck with the 55-year-old truck driver who's done this for his whole life. And these were good wages, by the way. These are good. You made a good living. You make a good living driving a truck. So that's one piece of this, but it's only one piece. And I think it's important to point out that it's only one piece. The second piece, and the reason you can tell that is, populism is not actually happening everywhere. Okay? I was just in Singapore. Everybody there remarks on the fact that there is no populism in Asia. Asia looks upon this global economy with enormous anticipation, enthusiasm, eagerness. If you look at the people running Asian countries, you know, the Prime Minister of India is a business-oriented, pragmatic reformer who wants to create a more integrated India with the world. The Prime Minister of Indonesia is a businessman turned mayor turned president. Same profile. Japan has the most reformist government it's had in years. Everywhere in Asia, they're talking about reform. Latin America, which is actually the original home of populism. If you think about populism, you know, you think about Che Guevara and all those Latin American populists who would nationalize the whole country and give free lunches to everybody and then realize that they had bankrupted the country. Well, Latin America doesn't have much populism anymore. Populism is dying. Think of Venezuela and Cuba as the remnants of an old era, and look at Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Peru as the dawn of a new future. That reality is pretty much true even in Africa, where you see countries like Kenya, Ghana, Botswana, Rwanda, all searching for a new path forward. So where do you see populism? You see it in Europe and the United States. And what's interesting is even there, you see it in countries in Europe that are doing well economically. Sweden has been growing at 4% a year. Northern Europe in general is growing fast. One of the things we're often told is that it is the decimated manufacturing class that explains the rise of this populism, right? This is the steel workers. You've all heard this story. Well, Germany has lost no manufacturing jobs in the last 20 years, and it still has right-wing populism. France has enormous protections for its workers and has still experienced enormous right-wing populism. 38% of the French public in the first round voted for the Front National. The one thing all these places have in common is immigrants, right? In every country that I've mentioned, whether it's rich or poor, fast-growing or not, losing manufacturing, gaining manufacturing, there are immigrants. And that is almost a kind of symbol of what is the second great cause, I think, of this phenomenon, which is culture. You know, there is a sense in which, and I want to be clear, it's not just about immigration. There's a sense in which an older generation of people facing these economic anxieties look at the world and say, my country is no longer the same. The single strongest survey question predictor of whether you were going to vote for Donald Trump was, how did you answer the question, I feel culturally displaced in my own country? If you answered yes to that, you were more likely to vote for Trump than any other survey question as a predictive tool. And it's about a sense of the world that you knew changing, right? And that I want to be careful. There are elements of race involved. There are elements of sexism involved. But it's not, it's a more complex cultural reaction to change. And I think that both of these come together in something that we need to think a lot about, which is the sorting that this economy is allowing between knowledge workers and non-knowledge workers, between urbanites and rural denizens. So the single strongest predictor, now a survey question of objective data, the single strongest predictor of whether you voted for Trump or not was whether you had a college degree. The second strongest predictor was whether you lived in or very close to a city versus not. The same two predictors were the single strongest predictors for the Brexit vote. So if you look at the National Front in France, you see something very similar. And in a sense, you're seeing a world in which you are dividing, you're sorting people so that a kind of knowledge worker pool and its associated service class is sorting itself into the big cities and their environs, and other people are being, I shouldn't say being left, but are staying out in the country in rural areas. And that divide has become so dramatic. Bruce Katz alluded to it a little bit. But consider these factoids. There are 3,000 counties in the United States. Donald Trump won 2,500 of the 3,000 counties in the United States. And yet, he got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, who won just 500 of those counties. Because the 500 counties she won represent 70% or 75%, depending on how you count it, of the people in the United States, 66% of the GDP of the United States, but 5% of the land mass of the United States. So think about how we are sorting into these meritocratic clusters around cities in which you have these knowledge workers who produce enormous economic output, and then the other 95% of the country by land mass, 36% of the country by population is producing 36% of the GDP of the country, right? I mean, that's the extraordinary shift that is taking place. Now, there's a further twist to this, which is that it's not just about these objective divides. It's about the way in which we perceive those divides in ourselves. So it used to be that it was very easy to tell how somebody voted in Western countries particularly, but generally true everywhere. You simply asked one question: how much money do you make? In the 20th century, voting patterns were absolutely predictable and related to your income. Working class people and poor people voted left of center. Professionals, white-collar people, rich people voted right of center. That was the basic, simple divide. Labor Party, Conservative Party, Democrats, Republicans. In about the 1970s, this began to change. There's a very good, huge study done by Harvard Kennedy School on this by a woman named Pippa Norris. And by the 1970s, people start identifying themselves not just as working class or upper class or not in economic terms. They start defining their identity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of national origin, ethnicity. That is when you have the rise of the constant describing people as Polish American, Italian American, Jewish American. In the 1950s, it was much more common to just call people Americans. I tend to myself prefer that, and so I've occasionally tried to edit my Wikipedia entry, which begins by saying Fareed Zakaria is an Indian American author or journalist or whatever it says. And I always think to myself, I don't know that that is the single most important quality to my writing, to my existence. And so I'd rather it come, I don't know, in the second sentence. You can, with Wikipedia, when you've got, 20 nuts who want to make sure that that the entry reads a certain way, you're never going to be able to change it. So I have unsuccessfully tried. But it speaks to this larger sense that we are defining ourselves more by these characteristics. And then, of course, you add to it now sexual orientation and things like that. And that has become the collection of things that people define themselves by. And by the late 1980s, you began to see this transformation affect voting patterns. So by the late 1980s, it was no longer, you remember the Reagan Democrats. What was unusual about the Reagan Democrats is that they were working class people who were voting Republican. Well, that was the beginning of this trend. And so by the mid-1990s, it was true that your views, your economic status was a less good predictor of your voting patterns than your views on abortion. 10 years later, it turned out the single best predictor of your voting pattern was your views on gay marriage. And today, as I say, the single strongest predictors are you urban or rural, are you college educated or not? So we are now getting into a kind of realm that Americans don't like to talk about, which is social class. And part of what is going on here is a sense of resentment and almost a revolt of people who think they are being looked down upon, condescended, told how to live by fancy pant, know-it-all, people who live in cities and are telling the rest of the country what to do. There's a very good Harvard Business School study on this subject, which it's an article in the Harvard Business Review. It's not so scientific, but it uses a lot of very good survey data to point out that there's very good evidence that working class people actually like rich people. They want to be like rich people. Who they really don't like are professionals. I hate to say it, most of you and me. And what do they not like about professionals? Well, they don't like about professionals as they are overeducated. They tend to define themselves by that education or by their profession rather than the place they come from. In other words, they define themselves by their acquired identity, not their original or ascriptive identity. They tend to live in strange places like downtown areas in cities that people don't regard as particularly attractive. They tend to want to live a certain kind of lifestyle that these people think is weird, like eating kale salad as our appetizer was, and arugula. They engage in strange practices like yoga and Pilates, right? And they believe this is virtuous, and they believe this is they are the advanced core of civilization, and they are going to bring all this to the benighted masses soon. And people resent that. And this is partly a class revolt of people who feel that they've had a lot of fancy pants professionals who look down on them, and they've had enough of it, right? And you can see this in the reaction and the strategy that Donald Trump has utilized. I've never quite been sure whether Donald Trump is a genius or whether he stumbles into these things. But on this issue, you can see it very clearly. Trump is constantly railing against political correctness and against all the elites who are always telling us how we can talk, what words we can use, what terms you're not allowed to use. And that's clearly a signal to feed this kind of resentment. He had, during the campaign on his Instagram feed, a series of photographs. It was him in his plane with the gold buckles, and he was photographed with a big bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And once he was with a big double cheeseburger from McDonald's. And what he's sending subliminally to his base is the message, I'm just like you, only richer, right? He's saying if you were rich like me, you would have a private plane, but you'd still eat Kentucky Fried Chicken, because that's really good. You'd still have a cheeseburger, right? If you've ever had the misfortune to be invited to Donald Trump's triplex in Trump Tower, which I have, it is basically a working class fantasy of how you would live if you hit the jackpot. this is the suite at Vegas you would check into if you hit the hard 8. And that's really part of what Trump's appeal is, that he's not a professional. He's a guy who builds buildings, and he talks like a guy who builds buildings, and he communicates in that way, and people love that. People love that because they think, here's somebody who gets me. Here's somebody who relates to me. We tend to think people vote on the basis of policy and ideas and, did he move left or right? People vote from the gut. They vote on the basis of emotion. They vote asking themselves, does this guy get me? If you think about Bill and Hillary Clinton, they have the same economic policy. They have the same advisors. They have, everything was the same, except a white working class person in Michigan or Pennsylvania or in Arkansas or Tennessee could look at Bill Clinton and say, he gets me. There's something about Clinton that made people feel that he got them. And if I can say this off the record, Bill Clinton's taste in food and perhaps in some other areas did not stray so far from his Arkansas roots, right? I'm glad I didn't have to fill in the blank on the second one. Hillary came across as a policy elite, as an intellectual. When she explained why she wanted her own email server, she said, I just needed to have a place where I could just do some private things like schedule my yoga appointments. And I've often wondered whether the problem was the email server or the yoga appointments, because it created that distance between her and these people. And here in this sense that you could know her, you could get her, she was one of us. That's what you're looking for in politics. As somebody who studied Bill Clinton put it very, very cleverly and in a Machiavellian way, he said the key to politics is you have to, like Clinton, you have to be able to fake authenticity. Once you can do that, you've got it made. So think about that. You have to know how to fake authenticity. And it's just very hard for Hillary Clinton to do that, for whatever reason. I think that these challenges, so if you think about it, what I've talked about is almost three C's: capitalism, culture, class, and then there's a final one to this: communication. We now live in a disaggregated media universe where everybody chooses what narrative they are going to believe. And I think that this is something that we've found it easier to understand, and I'm not making any kind of comparison other than the very narrow one that I'm going to make now. We found it very easy to understand how you could have Islamic fundamentalism, indoctrinate people in rural Pakistan or Afghanistan, or even in places like Algeria, or perhaps even in the West, because you hear about how people say, well, they select the websites to go to, they feed themselves a narrative, they believe that their narrative is the only narrative that makes sense. Everything is interpreted using those narratives and those facts, and that's exactly right. But unfortunately, it's becoming more and more true of all of us. We are all sorting our news and our information on the basis of the information we kind of want to hear. You have massive selection bias, and then you have confirmation bias, because you sift through and you look at all the information that confirms your bias and all the information that doesn't confirm it and somehow doesn't exist. 10 years ago when I would watch or go to the Fox News website, what was striking to me was, they were dealing with the same stories. They would just have a very conservative spin on it, and MSNBC would have a very liberal spin on it. Today what has happened is, you go to, let's say there's a day that there's embarrassing or awkward news for the president. You go to the Fox News website, they're not discussing that story. The lead story on Fox News will be illegal immigrant rapes a woman in Arkansas, right? It is a different narrative, it is a different set of facts, it is a different construction of the story, the arc line. And that reality is now powerfully influencing our ability to deal with each other. So don't just take these two factors that I've talked about, identity politics and this communication chasm, and think about now how difficult it is to compromise. Because the nice thing about politics that was based on economics, on economic identities, it's all math. You can always split the difference. You want to spend $100 billion, I don't want to spend any money. Well, guess what? There's a number in the middle there. You want to raise taxes 20%, I don't want to raise them at all. Guess what? There's a number in the middle there. How do you compromise on core issues of value, of national identity? How do you compromise with somebody about gay marriage, about the conception of what America is as a country, right? We have basically become Shias and Sunnis in the United States. We have become people with identity politics where it is heresy, right? It is treason to cooperate with the other side. That's why so many, I mean, you look at the last immigration bill that George W. Bush proposed, perfectly reasonable proposal that was a classic compromise bill, by which I mean everybody was unhappy because nobody got what they wanted. And that's how these things are meant to work. In a country of 340 million people, guess what? Not everyone agrees with your answer. So you have to cobble together a solution that involves giving, everybody a little bit. You couldn't do it because for the core political activists on both sides, compromise is now treason. Much better to go down with the flag flying than to admit, God forbid, that you had worked with Ted Kennedy, or that you had worked with Mitch McConnell, or that you had worked with John Boehner. And that is why we are where we are in terms of the paralyzed politics of today. That is at the root, I think, of this partisanship, because we've been partisan for a long time. You fight, and then you compromise, and something gets done. But now you can't compromise because it's about identity and because you have these narratives that feed the extremes on both sides. So to my mind, this makes it all the more important that we here try to ask ourselves, how do we bridge these divides? How do we try to do what has become harder and harder to do at a national level? And it seems to me that the solution surely lies in trying to approach these issues really from a bottom-up perspective, from a practical perspective, from a local perspective, from a win-win perspective, and trying to make sure that we kind of don't let this shadow of these larger trends infect the very good work that people are trying to do at the bottom. I mean, I think that this is one of the great challenges we face, but another one is to figure out how it is to make sure that whatever we are doing is truly inclusive. And I think that that's not just about economics. That's a big challenge. I don't know what you do with a 55-year-old truck driver, honestly. And I don't know that the answer is to ban technology. I mean, the problem with these things is there's no way to stop the machine, right? You can't uninvent what people are inventing with regard to these driverless cars. You can't stop China from growing. You can't stop India from growing, nor should we want to, because all these things are producing incredible innovations. Think about the extraordinary success against diseases like malaria, against malnutrition. You want to be able to harness all this, but you have to figure out a way to include people. And I think we have to have a richer understanding of what it means to include people. It's not just about economics. The average Trump voter in the Republican primaries made $72,000 a year. This is not purely about economics. It's a sense of dispossession that is cultural, that is social, that is about status. And some of it you can't do much. At some level, honestly, we are living in a world and in America where there are a lot more working women, and there are a lot more minorities, and there are a lot, of blacks who are rising to take their rightful place in American society. And that is going to make some people uncomfortable. But I think that one has to approach this. And my philosophy in life is always, you can look at the negative side of that, but if you approach it by making the assumption that people are good-natured and have goodwill, you are going to put forward the best you can anyway, right? And you will bring along those you can bring along, and you won't bring along those you can't. But you have to ask yourself, what here can we do something about? And I think that, I don't think, for example, companies think enough about the employment effects of what they do. I don't think they think enough about the communities that they operate in. I don't think governments think enough about what to do. It's great to set up innovation hubs, but it's also important to set up retraining centers. President Trump had Angela Merkel to the White House, and he said, the one thing we agree on, because God knows, you couldn't imagine two more different people than this theoretical physicist, East German refugee, on the one hand, and the host of The Apprentice on the other. But he said the one thing we agree on is Germany does an amazing job with its retraining and its apprenticeship programs. And we've got to figure out what they're doing that we're not doing. Well, I decided to spend a little time looking at it because I've also often been intrigued as to what it is that Germany does that the United States isn't doing. Well, there's one very important fact, which is they spend about 30 times as much as the United States on retraining. That begins to explain why Germany has that, because they're serious about it. This is not just bells and whistles. This is something you really believe in doing. It's also true that the culture has become too obsessed, perhaps, with a certain part of the society. There's a great blog post I mentioned at the lunch by this guy who was talking about, how if you live in rural America, it's like you don't exist. Nobody makes TV shows about you. Nobody writes songs about you. None of that world exists, which, by the way, explains the enormous appeal of country and country western, because it is the one authentic, popular entertainment or art form that still reflects and represents a huge swath of the country. Well, maybe that is something that Hollywood should think a little bit more about. Maybe it doesn't make sense for every movie to be set in New York or San Francisco, about young, hip yuppies who are about to, do an IPO. There's other people in America, and there are other interesting stories. And I think so we as a country and a culture have to come to realize that there's a way we have to try to all start knitting ourselves together and knitting ourselves back together. And if you can do that, I think you have a chance at healing the culture, which is where the rift really is. And then the politics will begin to heal itself. I don't think you can approach it by just saying, we're going to make some kind of a structural change in Washington or pass some bill, and somehow this enormous shift that I've been describing will just unmake itself. No, I think it's more likely that we are able to find some way to create a new community, and a community that is centered around some shared values and aspirations. I think that some on the left have their own challenges here, where the excessive appeal to identity politics. I remember talking to a young black activist at Yale who was explaining to me her frustration, and she said, you don't understand me, and you can't understand me, because I didn't share her race or gender, I don't know which. Well, the problem is, if that's the definition, if that's your definition of the problem, you're never going to find a way to bring people together. We have to find areas where we can understand each other, where we do approach things together in common as citizens. And if we can do that, I think you can heal the country. So I remain enormously optimistic. I actually think that some of the things that have happened in America over the last year have been very useful, because this problem did exist and it's been building. In a way, this has erupted and it is now in our face. And we can either do something about it or we can ignore it. But it was always there, and it had been building. And we were, perhaps many of us who were fortunate to be on the right side of certain divides, it was a little too easy to ignore them. But I think if we can take on this challenge and we can solve it, and it will be solved bottom up in groups like this, then we will end up with a much more secure, a much more cohesive, and a relentlessly dynamic America that we all, I think, hope for, believe in, and cherish. Thank you all so much. Thank you. 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 All right. Thank you. Yeah, that's what my mom says. Thank you. Thank you. Questions, comments, let's let it range freely here. Just keep in mind that it's late in the evening, so people are, so brief is better than yeah. Let's wait till you get the mic, because it's hard for people to hear. Over there. You could, but I don't want you to lose your voice.
So you started off the conversation in particular talking about jobs, employment. There's 107 million people in America not working. We've redefined unemployment. There's 150 million working to support those. Isn't that also part of this economic tension that we're feeling?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was trying to get at with that. You know, there are many statistics that show this. But basically, I mean, the fundamental fact about the world we are living in right now is that labor has no pricing power. You know, that's why there's no inflation, because in an advanced industrial country, inflation is wage inflation. Nobody, nothing else matters. And for the last 20 years, and you can see it whether you're countries that have unionized or non-unionized, it doesn't matter. No, labor just does not have pricing power. And in that circumstance, a lot of people drop out of the labor force. A lot of people take early retirement. A lot of people take disability. I mean, the number of people on Social Security disability benefits has skyrocketed in the last 15 years. It can't be that we suddenly, have so many more people with disability. I think a lot of people with minor disabilities just decided the trade-off is not worth it. That as I say, the broad challenge, and Bruce Katz was talking about this, is what to do about this. My own view is we are going to have to, we subsidize a lot of things in this country. Let's be honest. We subsidize housing, right? Interest deduction on mortgages. We subsidize pensions. We subsidize the taking on of debt. Interest is deductible for a company if they borrow money. We have to subsidize employment. There's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is probably the single most effective anti-poverty program in the government. Basically says if you work full-time and your wages do not get you above the poverty level, the government will top up your wages and get you to that point, because nobody should work full-time in America and make below the poverty level. Well, I think what we need to do is really expand that and get it to the point where people, because the truth is a lot of people are going to have to work in this country in jobs that are really perhaps interesting, fascinating, fulfilling, but just don't produce that much economic benefit. We often talk about the human touch professions, elderly care, child care, daycare, life coaches. All these are great jobs. They just don't pay that much because it's hard for a market system to generate the kind of economic output that allows you to pay. So I don't think it would be such a bad thing for the society as a whole to say, we still want these people, we value these people. And I think you can't just give a handout. That's what I like about the Earned Income Tax Credit. You want to reward people for work, and you want to reward them for the dignity of work. I think people like being able to say that they work, and they, particularly for men, but increasingly for women, people define themselves by these what it is you do. If you can't do something, I don't think, certainly in America, you can just say, well, we solved the problem by doing a cash transfer. So we need to be much more creative about this. They're experimenting a little bit with it in places like Finland. And we should, a la Singapore, the best thing would be watch some of these projects, do pilot projects in cities and states, see what works. But we are in for a future of fewer people producing more economic activity. The pie might get bigger and bigger. I think that I'm very optimistic about growth. I'm just not optimistic that you will be able to employ everybody in a way that pays a market wage. So,
you identified the reasons of the dysfunctionality in Washington, that they cannot compromise anymore. At the same time, Washington is changing dramatically now. The two parties are being pulled by different forces. Do you see a change coming? Are we stuck with that dysfunctionality? Is it going to get worse, or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
Oh, it's a good question. I think that the way I would put it is, I think we're in the middle of a great political revolution. So the old parties were themselves allied around these economic dimensions, right? I mean, the left, think about every party in the world. Left wing was more state intervention in the government, right wing was less state intervention. I think we're in, and the issue was the state, the role of the state in the economy. I think we're in a different political moment which is emerging, where the fundamental divide is actually not left-right on the state, but open-closed on the society. Do you want an open society, open to ideas, goods, capital, technology, people? Do you want a closed society? Do you want a society with more barriers, buffers, shock absorbers, right? And you can see it in the fact that, for example, the Republican Party is being transformed from what was a right-of-center party fundamentally defined by economics to a party that is more about culture, immigration, social conservatism. You know, it's become a populist, nationalist, protectionist party. The single biggest shift in political preferences in the last 25 years is the Republican Party's support for free trade. The Republican Party's support for free trade was in the high 50s 25 years ago. It's now in the low 30s, I think. It's the single biggest drop you've ever seen. And so it's been one of the reasons that the Republican Party was ripe for this kind of hostile takeover that Donald Trump did was that people hadn't noticed that the base of the party had been moving and moving and moving. And Trump, again, who knows why, saw it in a way that other people didn't. He realized they didn't want to hear about entitlement reform and free trade and expansionist foreign policy. They wanted to hear about, you know, culture, race, migration. I mean, Donald Trump's long, hour-long campaign speeches used to meander all over the place on economics. One day he'd be in favor of the national health insurance system, one day he'd be totally opposed to it. But he was completely consistent about those core issues, right? I mean, Donald Trump's message was basically to working class white Americans, your life sucks, and it's because of Mexicans, Chinese people, and Muslims. Mexicans take your jobs, the Chinese people take your factories, the Muslims threaten your lives. I'm going to beat them all up, you'll be great again, right? That's his 1-hour speech in 2 lines, but remarkably consistent. So that part of it is changing. Where it ends up, I don't know. You know, where it ends up is I mean, I tell you this, there's light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that young people everywhere seem to want to live in this much more open, connected, pluralistic world. They get it. They don't, first of all, they understand you can't do anything about it, but more than that, they actually they think that they are enriched economically, culturally, politically, socially by living in an open, connected world. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. I just don't know that there's a tunnel. I don't know how you get to that point, you know. So.
Yeah, so the question I've got from last night, we heard from Gallup about the despair index in the United States versus the happiness index in the rest of the world, which I thought was interesting. We have to actually measure 2 octaves below to get to our index.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you think the key drivers are to that, of why we see this huge disparity, particularly on your comments of young people seeing some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, but we're sitting with this despair index at all-time record highs.
One of the things I think people don't understand is that capitalism is not a benign phenomenon. We think of capitalism as it's nice, it provides opportunities, it provides growth, it provides jobs, you know, because again, we sit on a particular side of that divide. Capitalism does all those things, but capitalism is highly destructive. This is something that Karl Marx understood perfectly. He talked about how it destroyed old industries, old ideas, the settled rural life, you know, and it just completely destroys it, and on a scale that is difficult to imagine. Look at what Amazon did to retail in this country, right? You had all those little mom and pop hardware stores and bookstores, and they were on the main streets of every American town, and they're just gone. And now the next thing that's going to go is every suburb had a little mall where people would meet, and there'd be a Sears, and there'd be a Saks, and there'd be a Nordstrom, and they're just going to disappear, right? And that is fast, dramatic change. And then you have a society that has been changing, and you know there has been a lot of immigration. Let's not pretend otherwise. So all these things produce enormous change. And I think some of it is how you are then led. In those kinds of periods of change, you can either be led, you can either play on people's hopes or you can play on their fears. But there is a lot that has changed. I'll give you an example. Many of you will have read Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, right? Or you've heard about it. The returning World War II veterans. If you read that book, I think I have this right. Every single person in that book is a non-college educated white man who lives outside of a big city in the United States. And he comes back from World War II, and he's got a respected, honored place in American society. He maybe, joins the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club where he is, and he has and they get together for bowling leagues, and maybe he does some, little work at the local, in local office. That world has gone away, right? Those factories that sustain that employment have gone away. The social life that allowed, let's be honest, white men to be at the pinnacle of these little social hierarchies in every town and every community in America, that's gone away. It's a lot of competition at every level from all kinds of people who look different, who sound different, who seem different, who worship different gods. It's very unsettling if you were the greatest generation, and now you're looking at your life and it looks very different. So some of that despair is that sense that my country has changed and it's not what it used to be. And I think that it takes political skill and leadership to make people understand that change is natural. You can't stop it. And by the way, it's going to be great for your children, and it's going to be great for their children. I think there was, why don't we do one more and then,
So I was really intrigued by when you mentioned that Germany spends 30 times more money on job retraining. And I kind of personally agree that the U.S. should emphasize that in its spending. But, in the political process, how can we really get the government to spend money on things that's not right now? If we're going to spend more money on a different program, we're going to have to cut an existing program, and kind of the people that are benefiting from the program that's cut, they're going to go to Congress and lobby really strongly, while even the people that just barely benefit from this new change in spending, they're not going to lobby. So how can we kind of really push the government to make these types of changes?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because basically what we have ended up with in Western democracy now is something I think of as not majority rule, but minority rule. It's the rule of the concentrated minority that benefit from a particular program that are able to impose their will on the majority. Because there's a special interest for every existing government program, but there are no special interests for the future. There are no special interests for our children. And you can see this in one very simple, to my mind, alarming statistic, which is that the federal government of the United States spends $1 for every person under 18 in this country and $4 for every person over 65. Now that tells you exactly where our priorities in our political system are, right? They are basically toward the past rather than the future, toward consumption rather than toward investment. And I think fundamentally as a country we have to ask ourselves, do we want to invest? Is the great problem in America that everyone's taxes are not low enough? Or is the great problem in America that we suffer from a dramatic lack of investment in human capital, in physical capital, right? If you look around the world, if you think about these trends I'm describing, as I say, you can't undo them. We're living in an open, big, open, messy, dynamic, technologically changing world. What you could do is you could arm the American worker, the American citizen, arm him or her with a good education, with good prospects for retraining every time you slip from one job to another, from one industry to another, with portable health insurance, with the ability to upgrade your skills and talents when you can, with the best infrastructure in the world that allows you to get to and from work. I mean, one of the fascinating studies a Harvard economist did, Raj Chetty, was he found that places that had good public transportation had lower levels of inequality than places with bad public transportation systems, because so often we don't think of it this way. If you can't take a bus to a job, you can't get to the job. So you may be qualified for that job, but if you can't get to it, you're not going to do it. And so you have to find a way to get people to where they need to go. All these kinds of challenges, I feel, are what are going to define the 21st century. Look at the countries that are making it. China is making massive investments in infrastructure. It is tripling the number of what they would call community colleges, right? So we've got to keep doing that kind of thing. We do some, and by the way, I want to be clear, there's a lot that's right in America. There are a lot of places, particularly at the local level, that do extraordinary stuff. There's a lot of stuff even at the federal level that we do. But I think one thing we haven't realized is we're now in a global game. You know, I mean, you guys who are trying to get foreign capital into America, you understand it. Lots of people, it used to be that America and maybe 5 countries in Europe were the only places that had their act together economically, that had market economies, rule of law, etc. There are an awful lot of places that are catching up. The natives have gotten pretty good at capitalism. And so all of a sudden you have to ask yourself, what do you then need to do? And it can't be about wages. When people talk about Chinese wages, you're never going to win a competition with a Chinese laborer who's making 10 cents to your $12 an hour. You are going to win by having the best, most advanced infrastructure, the best, most advanced education, the best, most advanced technology that human beings can work with, right? That's your only hope, is to have the best, highest value-added use that you put to human labor. And we can do it. I mean, the United States, it's incredible how much we have been able to achieve with this level of underinvestment, frankly. Some of it is riding off the capital of the past. I mean, why is Silicon Valley where it is? It is not an accident that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the United States government spent literally hundreds of billions of dollars in military hardware and software in that particular corridor. 50% of all computer chips bought for the first 25 years of the industry's existence were bought by one government agency, the United States Air Force. And that was when the cost curve went down. So we forget these things, but you have to make investments. You have to invest in the future. The one thing I think, if I could say, the message I would send to our political system is, don't worry about giving me a tax cut. Worry about investing in my children's future. Worry about investing in their prospects, because that is what is going to produce an America that is as dynamic in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
As always, Fareed, thank you so much. You've helped bring together so many threads of the discussion that's been going on for the last day and a half. All day today, we've been looking at major innovations that could have a transformative impact on food, health, and economics. And then with the interview you did with Bruce Katz today at lunch, we began to look at the issues of cities. What's the future of the city? What's the future of rural areas? And we were also pleased to launch a new Empower Health project to have a direct impact on some of the major challenges in the health sector in this country. So tomorrow, those of you who are coming back for the program, we're going to look at ideas for our future. We've done 5 years of work together. Now, given all of these ideas about innovation, given all of these opportunities, given the wonderful framework that Fareed and Bruce have given us today and tonight, let's talk together concretely about how we, as Global Action Platform, make a bigger difference in the world as we move ahead. Thank you so much for being with us.
Sometimes